Louisiana has a past reflecting traditions and people and foods from all around the world. But one big business started in central Louisiana in the early 1900s, and it was one of the biggest in the world. Trees have been the basis for building homes for thousands of years. Logs were cut from trees with axes and saws and cemented together, forming a traditional log cabin. But the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s brought the creation of metal blades, cutting trees and logs with a motor powered by steam. I'm at the Southern Forest Heritage Museum, home of the biggest sawmill complex in the country. And now, a museum for learning Louisiana history. In the early 1900s, trees were chopped down all around the South, and logs were brought into the factory mills in Longleaf, Louisiana, to be sawed into valuable building lumber. Douglas Rhodes is the executive director of the museum, and he showed me around sites where the sawmills cut trees and logs into boards of all different sizes.
After the logs were cut into lumber, they'd go to the planer mill where they would be finished, and from there, they would be loaded on freight trains.
These railroads were built for shipping to other states and for just traveling around the factory. This is a hand car used for inspection, powered strictly by muscles. Cutting up those logs created an exorbitant amount of sawdust, which was never wasted. Historian Jim Barnett explains.
The sawdust from that would power the boilers that would generate steam power.
That steam power was enough to cut tree limbs into boards of different sizes that would be loaded onto the trains. Climbers okay?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. And those trains would ship fresh lumber around the country. This is steam engine 106. The technology of using the steam to power the logging equipment required employees. And as families moved in, the town of Longleaf, Louisiana was created, which meant a hotel, a doctor's office, a post office, a church, and a school. There are many other exhibits around the Southern Forest Heritage Museum, like war memorabilia. This statue is dedicated to more than 15,000 men who served in over 50 civilian conservation corps camps in Louisiana. More displays in different parts of the museum highlight places and people from Louisiana who fought in the wars. The Southern Forest Heritage Museum works to preserve and maintain the nation's most significant sawmill complex, and it provides great entertainment for everybody. You like being in a museum?
Yes.
I'm Johnny Atkinson, back home in Louisiana. And the Southern Forest Heritage Museum is in the city of Longleaf, Louisiana. It's open Wednesday through Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 4 o'clock. You can also rent locations of the beautiful area for parties and weddings.